All right, guys, welcome to another Note to File Live. I'm really excited about our guest today. I'm going to go ahead and drag him up on stage here. Dr. Derk Arts. How's it going, Derk?
It's going well. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Right on. And if anybody hasn't checked it out, Derk is been on the podcast before, episode 56. Go check it out at noteToFilePodcast.com. As a result, I won't necessarily make him, give us his full background, but if you would, Derk, maybe that's a little Freudian slip there, Derk Arts. Sorry. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Give us just a little bit of background.
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm originally from the Netherlands. I live in New York now. In the Netherlands, I studied medicine, so I'm a medical doctor, and I did a PhD in medical decision-making, worked a lot with real-world data to try to improve, basically evidence-based medicine. It's a very interesting time. I learned a lot. That's still relevant today. And when I was in med school, I started Castor to help make clinical trials more efficient, increase data quality, and hopefully also make it easier to reuse clinical data so that we can actually leverage the billions of data points that are sitting everywhere across the globe to again, get the right treatment to the right patient faster. My current review of evidence-based medicine is that it's not super evidence-based and it's definitely not very data-driven. And so I think we can still do better. So for me, Castor is about making clinical trials more efficient and more patient-centric and maximizing the impact of data on patient health and reducing the global disease burden. And I've been doing that very happily for over 10 years now. So it's been a great journey.
Nice. Yeah, and so, Castor does a lot of things, but I know today we want to kind of focus in a little bit specifically on eConsent. I know there's still a lot of questions and a lot of work to be done sort of around eConsent. And I know we want to get into a little bit of a demo here early on, but I guess I just want to kind of open up, initially with like, what are you seeing? I can give my, piece as well in terms of eConsent adoption, sort of, as things stand.
Yeah, I think we started pushing really hard into eConsent very early in the pandemic. I think in the first 2 months or something. So that means we have a pretty solid amount of time now that we've been sort of building a next generation eConsent platform. And I think at the time it made a ton of sense, and it still does. And this is what we're going to talk about, obviously. But I think the benefits of eConsent are pretty clear, but there's still a lot of questions and objections. And I think the biggest hurdle that I see is that people continue to see eConsent just as sort of digital paper, basically a DocuSign approach. And then obviously, if that's your bar for eConsent, then there's not a lot of difference between just giving someone an actual piece of paper. So I think the discussion should really be about modern technology and leveraging capabilities of modern technology. So my colleague who will come on soon, we'll talk about that as well in the demo. And so when I look at eConsent adoption, I think the problem I'm seeing is that a lot of vendors basically said, oh yeah, we can do eConsent, and they basically took this DocuSign approach. So the only problem they were solving is basically that people didn't want to touch a piece of paper during the pandemic, right? And so I think that didn't necessarily improve the perception that people have of eConsent, because they were like, well, if it's just that, then what's the point, right? And everybody was rushing just to be able to claim they had eConsent. And we said, okay, let's take the modern approach to eConsent and allow for rich media and sort of have a true platform approach. But I think the majority of the vendors out there took a different approach, which is why I think a lot of study teams are like, well, let's just go back to paper. It's cheaper, it's easier, it's faster. I understand it. And so I think we're seeing a bit of a bend in the adoption curve, which I think was pretty steep in the beginning, and now it's flattening out. And I think we even see some study teams kind of retracing, like not our customers, but we're talking to new customers, obviously, and we see study teams retracing their steps when it comes to eConsent. So I think we need to kind of reset this whole discussion and start really focusing on the true eConsent platforms and the benefits they bring to patients and sites. And I'm very excited to talk about that today. But to answer your question, I don't think we're seeing the same sort of accelerated adoption that we were seeing during the pandemic.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well said. I think, obviously we did a lot of scrambling in a lot of different ways, during pandemic just to keep things going. But in some ways, it did almost poison the well to some degree. That a lot of sites sort of got, to your point, really just fancy DocuSign, or maybe not even maybe even actual DocuSign.
For
And then
sure. Yeah.
it just became like, okay, well, this doesn't really necessarily provide anything additional that paper doesn't, at least not on the surface. And then again, to your point, many have gone right back to paper just as quickly as was acceptable. But obviously, there's a lot of promise that we haven't yet seen, and we'll talk some more about that and some more sort of specific examples. And in the meantime, I'll go ahead and drag Kristen up here if you're good. If you think we can start diving in that direction.
Yeah, I think our sort of the rest of the discussion is going to be easier after we've kind of seen an example of sort of a more complete modern platform approach to eConsent. So, Kristen,
Sure.
good to see you.
Hey, Kristen, how are you?
Hi, Brad. Hi, Derk. Good. How are you?
Good. Introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about Kristen.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Harnack. I'm the Director of Solutions Consulting here at Castor. But interestingly, I spent most of my career working with population health programs, social determinants of health programs, and looking at how you engage underserved populations, which I think is very applicable probably to our conversation today.
Yeah, no doubt. And, if you guys listening out there, I see you. Feel free to, leave some comments and ask some questions along the way as we, get through the demo and sort of expand on the conversation a little bit. So, whenever you guys are ready, feel free. You can present. We can kind of walk through here. So, this is still new for us doing some of these demos. So, you guys watching, bear with us here as we stumble our way through.
All right, let me see here. Perfect. Okay. So when we think about eConsent, there's a lot of different ways that it can really be applicable to clinical trials. And I think oftentimes, kind of as you both have mentioned, we default to, we needed an electronic version of our consent forms that we didn't have to sign in person to avoid, obviously, COVID during the pandemic. But I think when we start to look at the engagement tactics that eConsent really allows, there's a lot more to it than simply just signing electronically. It allows us to be able to recruit patients more effectively in remote capacities. It allows us to gather consent in remote locations. And really, it saves the patient from having to have another trip into the clinic. So, Brad, I don't know about you, but here in Kansas City, we have, I assume actually very similar for you, that you have a lot of rural patients that are being seen at your site. Is that
Indeed, we do.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of those rural patients might be driving an hour, 2 hours into your site, maybe more, maybe 6. One of my friends right now is in a clinical trial driving across the state of Missouri every couple of weeks, 6 hours for those in-site visits. So a lot of that can be eliminated with eConsent wherever we can. So not all, obviously, in-person visits can or should be eliminated. But eConsent is really one tool that allows us to be able to lessen the burden of the trial on participants. So even that initial visit where we have patients coming in to sign the consent forms or to talk about the trial, if they can do that remotely, that can help save them that 6 hours, even if they're in town, that 30 minutes back and forth across town through traffic, maybe having to take off half an afternoon of work, can really help to alleviate the burden of the trial on the patient's life. So when we start to think about,
sorry to interrupt. I mean, it can be, something that occurs to me so often. We don't even make it through the consent process. Oftentimes, we bring a patient in from 2 hours away. They come in, we only make it maybe halfway through the consenting process before something, sort of reveals itself that makes it to where, either the subject is unable to participate because of, something on their end, or some kind of exclusion criteria comes out. So essentially you've wasted a lot of time and money right up front by dragging people in when you don't necessarily have to do that. So that didn't even really necessarily occur to me until just now, but I just want to point that out.
Yeah. And I would imagine for some of those participants too, if they come in and do make that trip and it's not going to end up in them enrolling in a trial, maybe they'd be less likely to engage in trials in the future.
Yeah, they're not happy. They're not happy.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think really when we start to think about patients as people and their lives and what all they're doing to be involved in a clinical trial, it starts to make a lot more sense in looking at how we can better engage them in ways that are less disruptive to their lives. And so that's really where it all starts, is that consent process in recruitment. So being able to, of course, recruit patients through social media, through advertisements. That's definitely one way that we've seen an uptick in recent years. You can reach a wider portion of patients, a wider range of patients in the population by using social media advertisements, other types of online campaigns. But there's definitely also some creative ways that you can start to use an eConsent tool for recruitment. So you could start to work with community organizations, maybe having special events at churches, after church, having a special health and clinical trials event where you're maybe sharing a specific subject area that's passionate to that community, where you can start to really be mobile with some of the recruitment processes as well. Maybe you leave brochures with the information that have a QR code they scan that leads them to the trial landing page. Maybe you have on-site CRCs or CRAs who can talk to the potential participants about the trial and give them reassurance about what all it means and what the benefits would be. So you can have those types of conversations and really start to be more creative in some of those recruiting efforts that we've definitely seen on the chronic condition management side of things that have been successful at engaging, especially historically engaged and underrepresented populations in general health and in clinical trials. So we start with that. We can start by recruiting participants into a specific trial, and then it leads them to the recruitment landing page. So if this were really a situation where it was someone who you just were either met through advertising in a way, or whether you were just giving more information to, then the patient has that option to come and learn more about the trial at the customized page and even start the self-expressed interest enrollment pathway. And that really is the ability for a participant to say, I, right now, without any external pressures, am interested in this study and would like to learn more and potentially see if I'm eligible. And so it's a great way for participants to be able to get that first introduction to the study, whatever it may be, read more information and express that they are, in fact, intrinsically motivated and want to learn more about that study. And then at this point, we have options that can also help to ease the burden on the site itself. So as you start to expand those social media campaigns, you're more than likely going to start getting a higher volume of people that may be interested than if you were just in person.
We hope so.
Your staff, though, may not want to speak to, but may not have the capacity to speak to every member of that population who may or may not actually be a good fit for the study. And so that's really where the pre-screen questionnaire comes in, where you're able to either on the page or separately, you're able to go through and kind of do that baseline assessment that the patient can do themselves, where it's just their initial self-reflection. And that ends up telling them whether or not they are determined eligible for the next steps in the process. So this can all be fully automated, where we run that pre-screen, we determine that baseline. Is this patient someone who might meet the criteria for this study? If yes, then let's go ahead and invite them into the eConsent patient portal.
Hey, and Kristen, I think it's worth calling out that instead of that simple pre-screen that you just showed, which is, I think, pretty effective, we're also looking into partnering with some of the digital biomarker companies that have video and voice biomarkers to actually take this one step further and really reduce that funnel down a lot. So then I think you can remove a lot more pressure even from sites that have to, for example, do screening for depression or sort of Alzheimer's, just being in the right stage of Alzheimer's to be enrolled into the trial. So I think that simple questionnaire is just a starting point. I think as soon as we start to implement some of these more advanced biomarkers that have already been validated to assess disease severity, we can get much better results. And I think that's going back to your previous point, going to really reduce the burden on sites very significantly, because you end up with a group of pre-screened patients who have a much higher likelihood of in the end being eligible and then being enrolled in the trial. So I think this is just a starting point in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, it is oftentimes we're still digging through the haystack, so to speak, at the site level when you have a lot of, because it's a trick, right? You don't want to exclude people unnecessarily. You don't want to scare them off with a million questions, but at the same time, you want to be reasonably more narrow than just anyone who stumbles upon it and expresses interest. So I think that's always a interesting challenge, at least for us at the site level when we manage it ourselves. A lot of times we don't have control, on central campaigns, but that's really cool. I mean, I love that you're going to at least be able to narrow your funnel a little bit, and hopefully not, too far.
Yep, absolutely. So then at that point, once they have gone ahead and met that initial baseline and they're ready to speak with a member of the staff, at this point, they can join a video call to review the consent process and get all their questions answered. So actually, Derk, I'm going to ask both of us to briefly stop our cameras on the webinar.
This is the most stressful part for me.
Yeah, I can take you guys off the video there.
And then, Derk, if you would, what Derk is going to do from the investigator side of things, he is going to be joining from the eConsent portal. And here I can see from the patient side, I can actually see he's joined that portal. So directly from here, I am now going to join. We will both mute our lines so that we don't get a horrible echo here. And then we'll both be able to have that face-to-face conversation where we're talking and reviewing the consent form. And as we're reviewing that consent form, we both have this viewpoint with the consent form in front of us. So as that participant, I can ask any questions. We can review it piece by piece, make sure that we understand, that I understand what I am consenting to, what the study is going to entail. And then when Derk is assured that I understand as the participant, he can unlock that form to enable me to sign it. So at this point, I can add in my agreements, add in my Part 11 compliant signature, and then do that full process remotely. And this way, kind of as we talked about, we can go through the consent process, make sure that I know everything. There's not going to be any surprises before I make that in-person visit.
No, and again, I love this because, if you're sitting on a DocuSign, emailing to somebody blindly, or maybe not blindly is the word, but there's just a lot to be said about being able to interact with each other and see each other and read the cues, because sometimes you can be explaining something to a patient and you may not pick up on it unless you are right in front of them, but they can clearly are misunderstanding, don't understand. They have a blank look on their face. You actually get some level of engagement, because I know that's been a problem before in some of the e-consents that we've done, is that that it's easy on the phone for the patient to go, yeah, I got it. They sign it. It's pretty clear that they weren't, really weren't that engaged. So again, I love that small, not small, but seemingly simple inclusion of having the ability to actually.
Yeah, and I think what we're showing here is pretty sort of straightforward in terms of it's very much what most of our customers want, but we're trying to coach our customers into also considering spending a little bit of extra money on, for example, an explainer video. There's quite a few companies that do that for a very reasonable fee, and we can actually embed those as a step before the actual consent process. And one of the commenters already pointed out sort of the idea of sharing a consent beforehand. And I'm setting up this argument for myself, Brad, because we're going to talk about this after the demo. But the idea of sharing a video and then the actual ICF ahead of time, so someone is truly informed and they have sort of the basic explainer video and the ability to review the ICF, maybe with friends, family, or maybe a physician or someone who's a bit more qualified to read into that, and then come to a site. I think is already a pretty significant win, to be honest. But we'll talk more about that.
Yeah, and I've certainly got some thoughts around that as well. So yeah, we'll more to cover.
All right. So at this point,
yeah,
go ahead.
I'm done, right? I've done my, you're consented.
You have done your part, correct. So he has now signed as the investigator. I can see that that is now complete. And so from the participants' perspective, kind of to some of the comments that have come through in the chat, not only do I have access to this now signed and complete consent form that I can view or download at any time, but I also had access to a read-only version of this before the call. So if I had wanted to before the call, I could have come in here, viewed what that document looks like, so that I had some questions prepared ahead of time for this team member that I was going to be meeting with. So able to do all of that from this portal. And then that way, at any point in time, if I ever want to come back to that consent form, if I ever need to reconsent, same portal, I can see all the forms built out here as I have more forms maybe to sign. And that's a whole other, I think, topic of reconsenting that we could definitely get into too, which is also another great use case for eConsent, is to not make them come back in person for reconsenting, but being able to do that remotely.
Yeah, we just had to mail out about 40 consent forms, which doesn't seem like a lot to deal with, but it can take up some time.
I can imagine. I mean, making sure those all arrive and get returned back and chasing down the paper would.
Well, and inevitably somebody didn't date something, or inevitably forgot to sign a signature line. I mean, it's very easy to miss those things.
Yeah, and there's a delay between when it's signed and when it's in. If you have other platforms running, when it's updated, when it's integrated, all of that can definitely come into play as well.
Okay, I'm actually gonna throw a question up just because it seems like probably an easy one to answer. But phone and computer, I assume that there's going to be access through either sort of media there.
Yep, absolutely. So phone, computer, tablet, all of the above. It is going to be able to be accessed by
tablet is my favorite, I have to say, because then you have like a little bit of screen real estate, but you can still sort of comfortably sit on your couch or whatever your favorite place to sit or stand is. Tablet is really nice, but yeah, it works everywhere.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So they're immediately served, a signed copy. It lives here in a portal where they can access it at any time. It's not going to get thrown under the seat of their car and then chewed up by a dog, and then they're not ever going to be able to track down another copy of it again.
Right. Exactly. Yep. And then the other item on the back end of all of this, that was kind of the patient experience. But on the flip side, what you're seeing as the site is you're able to see all the different patients that come through those different recruiting channels, so that have been added as potential participants. You're able to see those that have passed that eligibility questionnaire that you may have ahead of time, and then those that may have consented. And for any of them that have consented, we can also further automate that integration with the Castor CDMS. So if you have surveys that are going to be going out, now your site team doesn't have to be worried about, am I sending these surveys on the right cadence? It can just all be automated from the point of that consent or from the whatever workflows you may have in place for the study. So all of that can be kind of a more seamless process when you have that integration capability with the other systems that you're using in the study.
And so you're talking about even serving ePros and things like that, potentially by automating the process of once they sign consent, they get fed into the other systems that Castor has. And again, that's a beautiful thing. And something I think a lot of people overlook is process, right? Like we see it all the time at the site, but like, oh, here's a tool. Well, okay. But how does this fit into a process, or does it have any process or workflow built around it? And oftentimes, more often than not, the answer is no. And then you've sort of got to reinvent the wheel at a site. Here, again, I can see everything. I know what's going on. I'm not having to sort of reinvent how I'm tracking consents or who's received a consent or what the hell is going on. It's all right here, in one nice portal. So I really appreciate that on the back end.
Yeah, and I think, again, modern technology. And so I just want to reiterate that a lot of the eConsent solutions on the market right now are either sort of a DocuSign approach or are just very old, and they existed, a decade ago, which brings some limitations, right? And so Castor built this platform API first. So literally every single thing that Kristen is doing in the interface has an API endpoint behind it. The API is developed first, and then we develop the UI on top of it. So there's a lot of valuable metadata here as well that you can push or pull to CTMS, or obviously to our own CDMS or EDC, or into a reporting environment. And of course, you can also tie a lot of automations to it. We also have support for webhooks now, so you can actually trigger based on an event in a system. You can trigger an event in an external system through a webhook. So the limitations the possibilities are endless. And I think it's important that people start to imagine, hey, what else could I do on the workflow side or logistical side using real technology platform that I can really truly integrate into the grander scheme of things.
Yeah, and again, I appreciate that, because I feel like so much of what we see are sort of black boxes, So as a site, again, maybe it's solving a problem, but it's sort of like creating three more in a lot of instances where, okay, cool, if this will pull into my CTMS, well, now we're talking. Now we're getting somewhere really exciting where I'm not having to manage and cross manage, all these platforms against each other, and instead they're actually, cooperating. Wouldn't that just be crazy?
Yeah. The most disappointing thing, I think, to me about where we are currently is the amount of duplicate data entry, and just, I created the subject here, now I have to create the participant here and there in this system. And the amount of times that you do that should have been the first thing that technology was able to solve. But so many systems today still don't talk, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, and it does create a lot of pain. So let me ask this then: once a ICF is signed, as a site, what happens? Can a monitor go in and review it? Does it just get downloaded as a file and pulled into whichever system a site's using? What does that generally look like?
Yep. So it can be all of the above. So we have viewpoints and user rights such that you can have view-only access to the information that you need to view for different users. So obviously, I'm logged in as someone who can see PII, but obviously that would be restricted for other users. They have the ability to do exports and downloads if they do want, but we also have that ability to do that deeper integration. So if they want the signed consent form to automatically flow into your, whatever other system that you want it to flow into, that's definitely an integration point that we have. So a lot of different options there. Here we actually have it deeply embedded with our EDC. So where I have it creating my subject ID, I can also have it taking me to that patient profile within our EDC, and it just opens me directly to that participant profile, and I'm able to kind of see that. And documenting if there's further enrollment information, for example, they're able to do that as well.
That seems so simple, and yet something you really just don't see anybody doing, unfortunately. So again, I can appreciate those sort of simple but elegant solutions that, again, most of the time you're just jumping between systems. Sometimes it's pulling data over, sometimes it's not. You're sort of guessing, playing a guessing game. So again, I love that.
Yeah, and that's honestly, we could definitely go into more detail, but at the high level of what eConsent is, it's really that. It's that ability to engage the patient in the ways that make sense for them. So again, that could be remote and fully virtual, as we just showed. It could also be in person. So if I wanted to reconsent this patient and they were in person and I had another consent form that I wanted them to sign, I can simply add that additional consent form and then have them sign this in person. It opens up, I can hand it to them on a tablet, and they would be able to go through now in person, similar more to their current state workflow, and have them sign off on the consent form. So can be very flexible. I think a lot of, patient centricity really is not saying one thing is right for all patients, but saying that we have options for what you need for different patients. So if you have one patient that really doesn't feel comfortable with anything electronic and they need to do a paper consent form and upload that, can still do that same process, still keeps it organized for you as a site in one location, keeps all your processes in place and streamlined, but allows the patient to have that freedom to do what they may need to.
Can I upload a historical paper ICF if I have to.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's exactly
Dang.
what that.
Can't stump you guys. No, again, that's great. And I'm with you. I mean, it's not every things have different levels of sort of, appropriateness based off of, the project or the situation or any number of things. So to have that flexibility is really key. And again, you don't see that across a lot of the existing platforms. I mean, frankly, we've had exposure to very few for as much as eConsent was sort of talked about. But again, the ones we did were pretty limited in options available. So again, I appreciate that there's pretty much some sort of option, depending on what your needs are.
Yeah.
Beautiful. What else? Anything else you want to dive into? I mean, I think that's probably, hits all the points that
I think so.
jump out.
I think maybe we can talk a little bit about maybe Kristen, you can stay on as well, if Fred allows it.
Of course.
Talk a little bit about, we've been trying to get you to use your eConsent. I think we had a whole discussion on your podcast about who should own what technology, and I think there's sort of a very light general consensus that there is potential for sites to at least own sort of eConsent and e-source solutions, which is something that I'm a big proponent of. But in the end, there's always roadblocks and things that get in the way of something like that happening. So, you seem to like our platform based on the feedback you've been giving us live. Thank you very much. But what's standing in the way of that actually taking off? Is it you? Is it the study coordinators? Is it the sponsor, the IRB? Why don't we have sort of broad adoption by at least the sites to consent their own patients in the eConsent setting? Let's park the sponsors for now.
I mean, so it's a great question. I do think partly it's been, as I stated, sort of the early experiences were just not really much value adds, right? So immediately for a site, we're already bogged down with all kinds of silliness. So it was pretty easy to be like, okay, this is not really adding much value. Something that I think is challenging is making, because again, I don't think it's necessarily appropriate for every and all trials, not that it has to be, but a lot of times once you consent that patient, your clock is ticking, which means they need to be in front of you because your window is 3 weeks, and you've got to get imaging, you got to get blood draws, you got to get physical exams, and for better or worse, a lot of what that screening visit is also sort of a test. Like, are you going to show up? Are you going to be here for the things that need to be done as a patient? Or as a participant, I guess. So now that doesn't, exclude the option of using eConsent even for patients that are in clinic. And I'm starting to come around a little more on, especially as we're enrolling 600 patients in a trial, and then it's really easy for boxes to be missed and checks to go unchecked. And then pretty soon I'm reporting to the IRB every 2 weeks because, we missed a consent form because we were, we didn't miss a consent form, but we missed a date or on a consent form or something like that. And that's not going to happen, with a system like Castor. And then I do think there's still some questions about like, what are sponsors okay with sites, bringing to the table. And I don't know that that's 100% clear yet, but as I'm always kind of happy to be the guy to take the jump and maybe try something a little different. So I do think it's important that sites start making the push.
So you think a sponsor would tell you that you can't use eConsent and that you have
I don't know. I've been told weirder things by sponsors, that we've tried to implement. It's a very sort of bizarre relationship. I'd like to say no, but again, they sometimes get antsy if things get a little bit, a little different. But frankly, that might be just some misplaced apprehension on my part. But as much as I like to think of myself as like progressive, I still have some of that, site like, oh, let's not do anything too different, or let's not rock the boat. Let's just keep it very simple.
Yeah, that's a pretty common theme, I would say. I'm actually quite curious if there's people in the audience that are listening right now that have gone through this process or have thoughts on this. Would love to see that come in. And Brad, I think we spoke about, like, I'm just very curious, like, what protocols do you have in the pipeline? Obviously, you can't disclose that like with a lot of detail, but how many do you think would obviously benefit from an e-consent approach, because they allow for maybe like an async consent visit, right, where consenting isn't sort of going hand in hand with some more complex screening activities such as a blood draw or something like that.
Well, and I mean, to that point though, I think as I start to look, it makes more sense in more places. But there are things we're doing now where it's actually extremely intuitive. Like we have a trial. This isn't unique to the trial we're doing. I've seen this before. Really, a lot of the inclusion is based off of a lab value. While the sponsor wants it to be done locally before anything else is done, because obviously they don't want to waste a $3,000 screening visit and then the patient failed a lab that we could have known about. So we can actually consent the patient. They go get a local lab draw. Well, they don't need to come to my office first for that. There's really no reason. And especially for those that are an hour and a half away, which is not uncommon. If you look at, Oklahoma City, it's one of the biggest cities by like area. So people are just spread out all over the place. That would be stupidly easy to do an e-consent. Go through the process, explain to them, hey, we're going to send you to your local lab. You're going to get a lab draw. And then if you're good to go, we could bring you in and do a full-on screening visit at that point. And we could find a lot of efficiency in that. That makes perfect sense. We do a lot of device trials where it's pretty much standard of care. They're going to go get local preoperative labs anyways. Those count, towards the inclusion or exclusion, whatever the case may be. And again, some of these patients, they have to get here at 2 hours before at 4 a.m. to get ready for their surgeries. They're having to stay in hotels. They're going through a lot of pain, just to get their surgery. And then you want to throw in extra research visits on top of it. No, we could easily e-consent these patients on the front end.
Nice. Okay, so let's do those, and then Greg, what are some of the ones that you think are less obvious, where you think maybe the study coordinator or whoever is dealing with the daily operations is like, please keep all this extra technology away from me.
We do like some biorepository trials where people are coming in for low dose CT for lung cancer screening, let's say. Now we're running through those patients, bam, 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 bam. As they're here, we're just sitting in the clinic and seeing them. And as much as I hate to say it, it's much simpler to sort of flip through paper, have them sign, and then move along. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm operating off of false assumptions here, since we haven't done it that way. But we're dealing with oftentimes a older rural population. Seems easier to get a piece of paper in front of me.
Can you talk us through what that looks like? I mean, I have a pretty good understanding of it, and I'm assuming most of the audience as well. But I mean, so someone magically arrives at one of your sites, and then there is a, let's say, 35-page ICF, which is, I think, not overly dramatic. Hopefully, it's in most cases it's less, but I know they're out there. So then what? Like, they literally flip through the pages. How does that work? How much time does that consume from the study coordinator is meeting with the patient, and like, to what extent does the patient actually feel comfortable? I mean, do you take that back home, that they consent form? Do they sign on the spot? Like, can you?
I mean, they're essentially signing on the spot. They're getting a phone call with an explanation prior to their visit. So they're coming here as part of their clinical care anyway. And they're going to see a provider, and then after they see that provider, they're going to get sort of shipped over to CT. So the provider also has an opportunity to talk to them, and then we talk to them in between their provider visit and then on their way to their CT. So, time is also, I wouldn't say time is of the essence per se, but we don't want to back up CT. That's sort of the perfect bottleneck in which to catch these patients. And again, it just seems it's very simple for them to, have been presented that piece of paper for them to look through and then walk over. We also go through the consent form line by line. We follow all ICH GCP guidelines in reviewing that consent form and documenting our process appropriately. So it's a little more high paced and a little more, definitely a little more fast paced.
And so they have seen the actual ICF before they arrive at the clinic?
No. yeah, generally signing. I mean, they are signing at the clinic.
Yeah. So I think, the question would be, what would it look like if, when you have that initial phone call where you explain them, about the study, that's actually the moment you send them, you give them access to the portal, you have the video there, they have the form there. They can still sign it in person, but I would argue that's still a pretty different patient experience from, okay, so I get a quick, like on the phone explanation of the study. We all know how difficult it is for patients to process that type of information. I mean, that's one of the first things they teach us in med school. And so then there's this gap, and then they go to the site, and then they're confronted with the full ICF. I would say it's presumably a better patient experience, and you'll have a more informed patient when they then, between that phone call and that actual visit to the clinic, have the opportunity to watch a video or a simple explainer, be able to go through the ICF so they recognize some of the language, and then come to the site. And then you can still decide, like, oh yeah, we sign it on paper and we upload it. But I think it's worth considering what the difference would be to a patient population.
And so that's where I actually see a ton of value. Like, again, if I could serve them with something besides just words that I'm gonna have them look at and sign anyway, that starts to really shift, I think, for me, a lot of the value too. Because again, first of all, again, we can talk about some things like, sometimes it's actually better for the provider to be the first point of contact versus some coordinator on the phone. Because, like, who the hell are you? What are you talking about? And they want to hear from their provider first. So sometimes it's letting them come see the provider before we even get to that point. But if you've got some video to be served or something that can actually be a little more descriptive, I mean, that's where I think there's a lot of value. But I just really haven't seen that, unless again, sites are trying to do stuff manually, which is just too much of a pain in the ass to do at scale.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think we need to just continue to push the envelope and see, if it's not the sponsors taking the initiative, can it be the sites that take the initiative? I mean, the sites are ultimately working more closely with the patients. They often have the relationship. So,
and frankly, if it were, I guarantee you, if a site shows up, has zero quality issues because their consents are all perfectly signed and dated, and somebody pointed out, let's see, where did it go? Sorry, paper isn't as necessarily revealing in terms of audit trails. So again, you've got a great audit trail with your eConsent. Your screen fail rate is lower because you've served people with information long before their study visit. They've had time to review it, and there's some kind of whatever media that actually explains it very well. I mean, sponsors are going to love it, and the sites are going to gain a competitive advantage by utilizing those tools, right? I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think there was one question here also on getting the IRB approved content into the electronic format, which I think is very relevant. That is, in some instances, it's a challenge because some IRBs just want the literal exact PDF to be sort of represented, and that's definitely the legacy way to do things. And so obviously we transpose the exact contents of the ICF into into the digital format. We even sometimes incorporate the stamps and obviously all the document numbering and dates that are all relevant. And then that gets sent back to the IRB usually to ensure that they're comfortable with it. And more we're actually automating the whole transformation process. So really having a sort of no human intervention, just converting the original ICF directly into digital format and using technology to validate that they're exactly the same. So we're actually, as we speak, pushing the envelope on that process, because I honestly think it's one of the least known but sort of biggest bottlenecks to eConsent. Sort of this, how do we get the IRB comfortable with a digital version of the ICF? But I think you can already see that if you're using just the old school PDF approach, it doesn't work well on mobile or on most devices, because that's the whole point of PDF. The layout is restricted. You can't embed any rich media in it or sort of additional functionality. So it just you basically go back to, yes, let's put a piece of paper in a computer. I can guarantee you that is not going to be the future state. The question is, how long does that process take for the industry to adopt that? And I think then the challenge is back to us as a tech vendor to come up with a process that makes it so easy for an IRB to say, oh yes, I know the exact same content is in this digital version as was in the PDF. And so we're working on that, because I think that's going to be one of the more critical workflows to really push into this rich media future for consent. And in the end, it does depend a little bit on the IRB, on what they're comfortable with.
Well, and that's sort of maybe something to consider is it's not clear to me yet how prepared IRBs are for really like sussing this out, because let's be honest, I mean, this is sort of a cliche, but like informed consent is not a piece of paper, it's a process, and it's all this stuff. It's not just the words on the page or words on the tablet. It's everything that leads up to and is part of that process. And this is a change in the process, right? So it does require, I think, more rethinking than just like, oh, well, show it to me in a PDF or show it to me on a screen instead of, on a piece of paper, because you still have to account for all the things. And I think, a good question here again is how, potentially a lot of the sort of consent process can be more well documented through eConsent. I mean, not even debatably, like a million times more, right? You can actually get some patient comprehension. You can see how long did they review it, rather than shoving an ICF in front of somebody and them signing it in, 20 seconds. There's a lot of potential value there in changes in process, not just delivery. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yep. It is a balance, though, for sure, to make sure that we don't overload participants, to make it a barrier to drop off.
So that goes all the way back to the early question about, I know we kind of touched a little bit on it, but, leaving a consent form or sharing consent forms. And I feel like this is a little bit of a testy topic for sites, because I don't want to throw a 45-page consent form at a patient without having a conversation about it and providing context, because I've seen it happen, and show them the consent form, they're going to go, well, Jesus, no, I'm not reading this is too much, I'm overwhelmed. So it's a real slippery slope, or fine line, I guess is a better way to put it, because obviously we're not going to withhold the consent form from patients. We want them to look through it, but we also want to curate that a little bit, right? We don't just want to be like, boom, here you go, good luck, we'll talk about it later if you want to.
Yeah.
So you're right. I think it is.
I think very soon we'll be experimenting with large language models to help with ICF comprehension. This is a whole sort of new Pandora's box that I'm not opening, but we've built up enough experience now to know how you can actually put guardrails in place and have perform in a much more structured way to kind of remove any chance of sort of hallucinations, because I do think that there is a lot more technology can do to even help with comprehension of your boring 45-35 page ICF. So I guarantee you in the next probably year, you're going to see a lot of technology coming out that's going to center around that. The challenge is going to be, again, acceptance by the IRBs and sponsors. But I think the future for patients is very bright when it comes to actually making this consenting process more patient friendly and making it much easier for them to comprehend what is required of them, and also what everything that is in there means. Technology is very able to to help them with that. So stay tuned.
Yeah, well, and to your point, like so much of what's going on right now, we're probably just seeing the tip of the iceberg, right? I mean, we're still babies in a lot of these new processes and new technologies.
Yep. How many of us knew what Zoom was 3 years ago?
What's that?
How many of us knew what Zoom was 3 years ago?
Right.
It's definitely taken on a life of its own. So it'd be interesting to see where it goes.
No doubt. And I mean, another interesting comment here again is like the ability to embed, the full patient journey, patient schedules. Those are in consent forms, but frankly, they're oftentimes, I mean, it's a big, ugly grid. The grids in the protocol, right? It's one of the first things we look at, but you throw that in front of a patient and they're like, what the heck? This is a big, messy grid that could definitely be served to patients in a much more organized and just easily accessible way. So no, again, I think the sky is the limit. We're just now even deciding what's possible, and there's probably a lot we just don't we haven't even thought of yet, right?
Yeah. Well, and so much of it is really the mind shift change too, because most of the consent forms historically, you look at the verbiage in it, it's very much meant to, yes, explain, but also a lot of legal jargon to protect.
Yeah.
That's a huge part of it. And so it's not necessarily historically been, is the patient at the forefront. And I think that's part of what the patient centricity kind of movement has been, is if we're thinking about this from starting with the patient, not altering it later, ending with the patient, but if we were to start with the patient, what does that look like and how does that change?
That's a fair point. It almost seems like the worst way to educate a patient is to shove 20, 30, 40 pages of paper in front of them, right? It is. And I've heard that, sort of aphorism, like, again, ICF, it's more about protecting the sponsor than it is informing the patient, right? So that's a fair point. Fair enough. You guys have anything else before we sort of wrap up here? If you guys have any questions, get them in. Do we think the fact that metadata are analyzed prevents sites acceptance to some extent? In other words, the sites feel too much oversighted. I don't think so. If anything, I think sites may embrace again that. I've been beaten up over like some of the weirdest stuff on consents, like a stray mark that a patient leaves, or that they date something in a different format than normal. And, I'm like, patients aren't responsible for GCP. They're not trained on GCP. So if anything, I'd feel better about it because there's some actual standardization, right?
Yeah.
It's just like when we had paper diaries. Patients would write wacky stuff all over them, and you'd be like, please don't do that. ePro fixed that. Obviously, you can't just write random notes that, then sites have to follow up on, and actually creates more work for them. So, I would sort of welcome, I guess, the, extra oversight in this particular regard.
Yeah, I think that this should just be very helpful, I would say.
Cool.
All right. I think we've shared what we wanted to share. Kristen, do you have any parting thoughts that you haven't expressed already?
No, I don't think so.
All right. Same for me. Thanks for having us, Brad.
Yeah, absolutely. Where can people find you guys online, and where can they learn more about Castor?
Yeah, people with a genuine interest in connecting with me and with us can obviously connect with me on LinkedIn, and same for Kristen. And they can go to our website and reach out to us, or just send us a message on LinkedIn. Very, very flexible.
All right, guys. I appreciate you, and I'm sure we'll have you on again before too long. Make you guys demo some more stuff for us.
Nice. Look forward to it. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.